They were barely 2 months old, and two golden retriever puppies, soaked, freezing, their tiny bodies trembling as they pawed at a stranger's door in the middle of a snowstorm. No shelter, no names. Just a desperate hope that someone, anyone, might hear them. Inside, a woman who had locked the world out for over a decade heard a sound she couldn't ignore. What happened next? It didn't just save their lives, it brought her back to life too. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe no soul should be left out in the cold, hit that subscribe button. Because this one will melt even the coldest heart. The storm rolled in with a vengeance, dragging the sky down to the rooftops of Balsam Ridge, a quiet Minneapolis suburb now buried under a merciless white tide. Snow fell in brutal sheets, no longer drifting gently, but instead hammering the ground like nails from the heavens. The air was a biting force, the kind that cracked skin open and left no trace of warmth. Wind rattled mailboxes, shook porch rails, and screamed down empty streets like some forgotten god returning to claim a forsaken world. No one in their right mind would be outside in this weather, and yet they were. Two golden retriever puppies, no more than 8 weeks old, staggered down the side of Sycamore Lane. Their bodies, once fluffy and full of warmth, were now drenched and matted, their golden coats darkened to a dirty, wet brown. They were thin, not starving yet, but close, bellies empty, ribs faintly visible beneath trembling fur. One of them limped, its left paw cut, likely by a sharp chunk of hidden ice. The other walked with uncertain, swaying steps, leaning into its brother as if trying to keep both of them moving. They had no names, no collars, no destination, only the storm and each other. The houses they passed were dark, blinds drawn, lights out, residents huddled inside near fireplaces and flickering TVs. Not a soul noticed them. Not one person looked out through fogged glass to see two small shadows dragging themselves through the powder. The puppies had stopped making sounds an hour ago. Their voices had gone hoarse, then silent, drowned in snow and swallowed by wind. All that remained was instinct. Move forward. Keep going. Don't lie down. Not yet. Eventually they reached the final stretch of the lane. At the corner stood an old house, 2 stories tall, modest, with aging siding the color of slate. Light spilled out through 2 front windows. Dim, warm, golden. The porch light was on. Faint smoke drifted from the chimney. The storm seemed to push them toward it. They climbed the porch in agonizing movements, one paw at a time. Both collapsed at the top step, chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. The limping pup, just slightly bigger than his brother, raised a trembling paw and scratched weakly at the wooden door. There was no sound inside, no movement. So it tried again. Its claws dragged down the panel with a quiet rasp, barely louder than the storm. The second pup huddled against the first, pressing close, seeking whatever warmth it could find. They lay curled together, a mound of wet gold in a sea of white, waiting for something they couldn't name. Waiting for someone. Inside, Grace Halden was upstairs in the attic for the first time in over 2 years. The house was silent except for the wind screaming through the eaves and the low groan of old floorboards under her feet. She wore a long gray cardigan over a navy flannel nightgown, her thick wool socks whispering against the floor. Her frame was tall but slightly hunched, as though years of grief had gently pressed her shoulders forward. Her once brown hair was now mostly silver, twisted into a loose bun with fine strands curling at her temples. Her face was pale, lean, the faint freckles on her cheeks faded almost to memory. Her hands, veined and calloused, moved slowly as she opened a storage bin marked Adam Grade School. She hadn't meant to come up here. The attic was where she'd placed everything she couldn't bear to throw away. Sketchbooks, tiny shoes, holiday cards, science fair posters, but something about the storm had pulled her from the living room fire, past the half-finished tea, up the stairs and into memory. She lifted out a crayon drawing, a lopsided dog wearing a cape and a name tag. Charlie the Brave, it read in crooked letters. Her lips didn't move, but her breath caught, just for a moment. Daniel, her husband, had always been the one to encourage Adam to draw. He'd sat with the boy for hours after work, even on the days when exhaustion clung to him like dust from a long shift. Daniel had died on a slick winter road 14 years ago. Adam had been in the passenger seat. Grace hadn't opened that box since the funeral, and now, surrounded by dust and insulation, it felt like the only warm thing in the house was a piece of colored paper clutched between her fingers. She sat back, the drawing in her lap, and exhaled. Below, beyond the attic floor and behind the front door, two lives waited. Outside, the wind shifted. The snow grew heavier. The second puppy, smaller, thinner, began to whimper again, the sound like the rustling of dead leaves. His body convulsed once, then stilled. The limping pup tried to nudge him, nose shivering, then raised his paw again and scraped the door. Inside, Grace stirred. Still in the attic, she stood slowly, joints aching. She wasn't sure why, but a sudden weight pressed against her chest, as if she'd forgotten something urgent. She closed the box, her fingers hesitating on the lid, and moved toward the narrow stairs that led down. She passed the old family photos on the hallway wall without looking, past the thermostat, the fire, the cat asleep in his usual spot under the chair. She paused near the door. The storm's howl was louder here. She stared at the wooden frame. Something, some memory, unfolded at the back of her mind. A moment from long ago, a soft knock. A child waiting. But tonight, there was no knock. Just silence. She turned slowly and walked back toward the kitchen. The wind groaned behind her. And outside, the puppies lay motionless. No more scratching, no more sound. Just two small shivering shapes collapsed against the door, waiting. Grace Halden sat curled in her armchair, a plaid wool blanket drawn tightly over her knees, and a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. The fireplace cracked behind her, its flames sputtering against the draft that slipped through the old wooden beams of the living room ceiling. The storm outside had grown louder. Wind lashed at the siding like a desperate animal, but Grace barely flinched. She had grown used to noise. Silence, real silence, was the thing that frightened her. The television flickered across the room, casting soft blue light over a space that was otherwise warm and amber. The screen played a rerun of an old baking show, but Grace wasn't watching. Her green-gray eyes, dull from years of retreat, stared past the television, unfocused, lost somewhere between the crackle of the hearth and the white noise of her thoughts. Winston, her black and white cat, 11 years old and as slow as a shadow at dusk, lay curled near the fire. Occasionally he twitched his tail, as if agitated by something unseen. A faint sound came again, a scratch, or perhaps a scrape, but Grace didn't turn her head. She had heard something like it before, minutes ago, when she was coming down from the attic. Then, too, she had paused, but it hadn't been worth reacting to. Her mind had dismissed it. The storm. A branch. Ice breaking loose from the roof. She told herself that again now, even as her fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. She took a sip and grimaced. The tea was lukewarm, bitter. She reached toward the side table to set it down, but hesitated. That sound again. This time followed by something smaller, something softer. A whimper. No louder than a breath, it slipped through the wind like a plea buried in snow. Her shoulders stiffened. Grace had learned long ago not to respond to every cry. There had been enough of them, real and imagined, after the accident. People had come to her door for months. Neighbors with condolences, casseroles, community invitations, church volunteers, grief counselors. She had turned them all away, politely at first, then coldly. When everyone finally stopped knocking, she felt relief. The house became her sanctuary, her exile, her cocoon. But tonight, that sound didn't feel like a person's. It felt smaller, more vulnerable. She stood slowly, her knees creaking beneath her nightgown, the blanket falling from her lap. As she moved toward the window, Winston raised his head, ears flicking toward the front of the house. She noticed this, frowned, and gently placed her cup down. The window looked out over the porch. Frost feathered the corners of the glass, but through the blurry veil of snow, she could just make out the amber glow of the porch light. Nothing moved. She turned away. The sound had stopped. Outside, the puppies were losing their battle. The larger one had stopped scratching. Its paw, raw and red, rested limply on the threshold. Snow had begun to build over their backs, layering itself into their fur. The smaller one, the one that hadn't moved in some time, still breathed, but barely. Its chest rose in shallow, uneven pulses, their bodies huddled tighter, instinctively preserving the last of their warmth. From the street, the house looked like any other, old but well kept, inviting even. The porch light fought against the storm, like a match in the wind. To the puppies, it had been the only sign of safety left in a world that had given them none. Back inside, Grace resumed her seat, but didn't reach for her tea. She sat still, listening. The television's volume was low now, drowned by the wind. Her fingers rested in her lap, twitching against each other. It wasn't guilt. Grace had trained herself to resist guilt. It was something else, a pressure, a thrum behind her ribs, a rising unease that she couldn't place. She glanced toward the door again. Something about the silence outside disturbed her more than the sound. She looked at Winston. The cat was still watching the door, ears alert. Grace's lips pressed into a line. She didn't want this. She didn't want to care. In another house on another street, someone else might have gone to the door immediately. A younger woman, a mother, a girl with time and softness left in her heart. But Grace had already lived through the worst. She had loved and lost enough for several lifetimes. Love was pain. Responsibility was a trap. Caring pulled you out of yourself. And when you got pulled too far, you drowned. She closed her eyes. Another soft whimper. Impossible. Hadn't it stopped? She opened her eyes again. For the briefest second, she imagined Adam, her son, on the other side of the door. Cold, calling. Just one more time. That cruel trick the mind plays, that impossible echo. It vanished as quickly as it came, and in its place, fear. Not of danger, but of breaking routine, of opening herself. She stood again, faster this time. This wasn't her problem. It couldn't be. She paced the kitchen, hands fidgeting with her cardigan. When she reached the sink, she turned on the faucet. Water poured out. Too much. She shut it off. Her breathing was uneven. Winston meowed. That simple sound undid her. She walked back toward the door and stopped, standing just behind it, staring. Her hand reached for the knob, but it hovered, unsure. The wind shrieked again, rattling the panes. She didn't know if it was still there, whatever it was. Her fingers twitched. And then she turned away. Outside, the wind buried them deeper. No one had come, and so the porch became their shelter, the door their final hope. They didn't cry anymore. They just waited. The scratching had stopped. Grace stood in the kitchen, her back against the cold counter, palms pressed flat on its edge. Her breath came in slow, steady waves. But inside, something flickered, an unease that had transformed into a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to name in years. Fear. Not of danger, not of the storm, but of the thing she might find if she opened the door. Or worse, the thing she might not. The silence outside was deafening. She turned off the faucet she hadn't meant to turn on and dried her hands slowly with the edge of her cardigan. Winston, her black and white tuxedo cat, had moved from the hearth and now sat by the door, his body stiff, tail twitching, eyes locked on the threshold. Cats were creatures of comfort, Grace knew. They didn't stare at cold doors without reason. She stepped forward. Her bare feet brushed against the draft, slipping through the floorboards. The wind shrieked again, but weaker now, as if even the storm had grown tired. Grace reached out. Her fingers curled around the brass knob, cold to the touch. She closed her eyes just long enough to push away the image of Adam. The last time she had stood at a door, with her hand trembling like this, it had been the ambulance, the paramedics, the moment her world split apart. She turned the knob. The door opened with a groan. The wind rushed in, biting and sharp, bringing with it a swirl of snowflakes that scattered across the wooden floor. For a moment, she didn't see them. She only saw white, heard the wail of air moving past her like a warning. Then her eyes dropped. They were there. Two small forms, curled so tightly they might have been one, covered in snow, silent, still. One had its paw draped over the other, as if to shield it. The larger pup's side rose and fell with faint, stuttering breaths. The smaller one barely moved. Their fur was soaked and crusted with ice, their eyes half-lidded and glazed. Grace inhaled sharply. A hand flew to her chest. She didn't move for a second. Then she dropped to her knees. They were barely alive. The larger one blinked. The other didn't. She reached out slowly, placing her palm near their snouts. There was warmth, faint, fading, but still there. She hesitated, the cold seeping into her bones through the floor. Her fingers hovered over their backs, unsure of where to touch, how much pressure they could withstand. And then she did what she hadn't done in over a decade. She opened her arms. Grace scooped both puppies gently into the crook of her elbows. They were lighter than they should have been. One let out a low whimper, a sound so quiet it might have been imagined. She cradled them close to her chest and staggered backward, pushing the door shut with her heel. The warmth of the house rushed around her like a blanket, but it didn't reach the tiny bodies in her arms. She carried them to the hearth, knelt beside the fire, and lowered them onto the thickest blanket she could find, a tartan throw from the couch. The light of the flames cast gold across their fur, revealing patches of pink skin beneath the matted curls. She began to rub them gently with a dry towel, whispering nonsense under her breath, words she hadn't used in years. Her voice cracked around them. "It's okay. You're safe now. You're not alone." She didn't know why she said it. It hit her as she wrapped the smaller one, the weaker one, in a warm hand towel and pressed it gently against her body. The last time she'd held something this warm, this helpless, this desperately in need of saving, was Adam. That night had been unseasonably cold for spring. The storm came out of nowhere. She remembered standing at the curb as the paramedics lifted her son into the ambulance, his arm limp, his glasses askew. He wasn't crying. He'd been in too much shock. Her husband Daniel had already been declared gone at the scene. Adam was breathing. That was all she had left, and even that, in the end, slipped away. Grace had never held anyone close again, never felt the warmth of another soul under her arms, until now. And now, two near-lifeless bundles lay against her ribs, their tiny hearts beating out a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. Tears came suddenly, hot, sharp, involuntary. They slipped down her cheeks, stung her lips, and soaked into the thick fur of the larger puppy she had pulled to her chest. She didn't bother wiping them away. She let them fall, let them stay. 12 years without crying. 12 years of refusing to feel anything she couldn't control. And all it had taken was a knock at her door. Not from a person, not from the past, but from two shivering, voiceless lives who had asked for nothing but warmth. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. She didn't know who she was speaking to. Daniel, Adam, the puppies, herself. Maybe all of them. Across the street, the storm began to calm. Snow still fell, but slower now, drifting rather than stabbing. A streetlight flickered and stayed on. In the house next door, the silhouette of a figure appeared at a window, a woman in her 20s, pale-faced and wrapped in a hoodie, watching the storm's tail fade. She didn't know the woman across the street. No one really did. Grace Halden was just a name, a shape, a mystery. But tonight, her porch light was still on, and behind that door, someone had opened up. The night had deepened into that still, cavernous silence only winter knows. Outside, snow had softened to a lazy drift, its fury spent, leaving a pristine white sheet across Sycamore Lane. Inside the modest home at the end of the street, warmth pulsed slowly back into the quiet, room by room, heartbeat by heartbeat. In front of the fireplace, on a thick tartan blanket, two tiny forms lay wrapped in flannel and towels, unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of their chests. Grace Halden moved with careful purpose between the living room and kitchen, her silver-streaked hair loose for once, spilling over the shoulders of a worn gray cardigan. Her eyes, pale and rimmed with tiredness, flicked constantly between the bundle by the hearth and the warm milk she stirred in a small saucepan. She didn't measure the temperature with a thermometer. Her hand hovered over the steam, instinct guiding her more than knowledge. She hadn't fed a baby anything since Adam, and dogs weren't children, but they were helpless in the same way, cold and small and trembling at the edge of life. She returned with a chipped ceramic bowl and a small rubber syringe she found in the bottom of a drawer. One of the puppies, the slightly larger one, had stirred once or twice, but was now curled tightly again, its back pressed against the smaller sibling. Grace sat beside them, legs folded awkwardly under her, and reached for the bigger pup. Its fur was still damp in spots, though she had dried them both hours ago. She tucked a towel under her arm and slid her hand under the puppy's chest. It whimpered softly. Grace froze. The sound was so faint she almost missed it. but it was real. Her throat tightened. Slowly, gently, she lifted the pup, cradling it against her chest as she brought the syringe to its nose. Its eyes remained closed, but its tongue flicked out weakly at the scent of warmth. She squeezed the syringe slowly, a drop at a time, whispering as she did, "Easy there. Come on now. Just a little." The puppy licked, swallowed, and whimpered again. Life, small and fragile, was stirring. The other one hadn't moved at all. Grace set the first pup down beside the hearth again and turned her attention to the second. Smaller, its fur lighter, face narrower, almost delicate. She touched its paw. No response. She lifted it into her lap and began drying its ears again, though there was nothing left to dry. Her hands moved automatically, her mind drifting as it often did when overwhelmed. She needed more towels, more blankets. Leaving the pup tucked safely beside Winston, who had taken up guard beside them, Grace stepped toward the hallway. She hadn't opened the closet at the end of the corridor in years. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust and memory. As she rummaged through a stack of linens, her fingers brushed something plush, small, rounded. She pulled it free. It was a stuffed dog. Brown, with floppy ears and a felt cape. Its eyes, once shiny, were now dulled by time and grime. Around its neck was a faded tag with the name Charlie written in blocky crayon letters. Her fingers trembled. Another plush figure sat behind it, smaller, yellow, with button eyes and a missing tail. Milo, read the name tag. They had been Adam's favorites, his bedtime companions. She had sewn Milo's tail back on twice. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, one toy in each hand, her vision clouded not by tears, but by the flood of warmth and pain those names carried. She carried the toys back to the living room and placed them gently beside the two puppies, now nestled together beneath a folded towel. As she sat beside them again, she looked down at their fragile forms and let the names tumble from her lips before she could think twice. "Charlie," she whispered to the larger one, who twitched slightly at the sound. "Milo," she said to the smaller, still unmoving body, brushing a finger gently down its nose. Silence again. Then, barely audible, a whine. It came from Milo. Grace gasped softly, her hand going to her mouth. The little pup let out another sound, pained but unmistakably alive. Its tiny limbs trembled as if unsure whether to move. She bent over, tears brimming once more, and laid her cheek lightly against the pup's head. "You're here," she said, voice breaking. "You're still here." Winston meowed once from beside the hearth, and Grace looked at him with something like a smile. "You might have to share your kingdom, old man," she murmured. Outside, across the street, porch lights began to blink back to life. The storm had passed. Snowplows carved paths in the distance, their orange warning lights flashing through the night. In a house 3 doors down, a retired nurse named Helen Boyd, stocky with frizzy gray hair and a perpetual frown, watched the movement from her window and made a mental note to check in on Grace the next day. She hadn't seen her in months. She didn't expect an answer, but Helen had a way of checking on people without asking permission. Back inside, the fire burned low. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second marking a breath regained. Grace sat with the puppies cradled in blankets beside her, their shallow breathing now growing steadier, fuller. She leaned back against the couch, her eyes closed for the first time all night, the weight of the past pressing less sharply against her chest. They still didn't have collars, no home, no history, but they had names now, and they had her. The light outside had changed. The storm had passed 2 days ago, and while the snow still blanketed the earth in thick, muffling layers, the sky now held a softness that hinted at something more forgiving. The sun didn't shine brightly. No, it hung behind gauzy gray clouds. But it cast a diffused glow that seeped through the windows of Grace Halden's living room and painted long rectangles across the worn hardwood floor. That soft light caught the golden fur of 2 small bodies tumbling near the couch. One larger, bolder, the other smaller and more careful, but both alive with the restless curiosity only healing can awaken. Charlie, the bigger pup, was now strong enough to dart clumsily across the room, his tail wagging in crooked loops. Milo followed close behind, quieter, but no less determined, occasionally tripping over his oversized paws as they played a disorganized game of tag. They darted beneath the coffee table, emerged by the fireplace, and then crashed into Grace's ankles, sending a stack of folded laundry into disarray. Grace, who had once hated disorder, found herself smiling. She stood at the kitchen counter, hands stained faintly with ink, a mug of black coffee beside her, and an old spiral-bound journal lying open. Her cardigan was draped over the back of a chair, and she wore a faded blue turtleneck tucked into soft gray slacks. Her hair, usually pinned back, was loose again, falling just past her shoulders in silver wisps. She looked softer now, still weary, still worn, but lighter in some way, as though a thin veil had been lifted from her face. She picked up her pen and wrote carefully, her handwriting looping with quiet elegance. January 18th. Charlie chased a dust bunny under the piano this morning. Milo was afraid of the broom, but brave enough to lick Winston's tail. I caught myself laughing. It felt like someone else's voice. She paused, the pen hovering over the page, then continued. Last night I dreamed I was walking with Adam again. He was 7. We were in the park, and he was wearing that ridiculous orange hoodie with the monster face. He was laughing at something, probably at me, and then he turned and said, "Don't forget to name them." When I woke up, the house was quiet, but I said their names out loud anyway. She closed the journal slowly, pressing her hand over the cover. She hadn't written in a diary in more than 10 years. The last entry had been the day of the funeral. That one had ended with a sentence she'd thought she meant forever. "I'm done opening my heart. It only lets the world in to break it." Now there were paw prints on the hallway rugs and scratch marks on the edge of the back door. She wasn't sure what that meant yet. Charlie barked suddenly, his voice still small, squeaky, and bounded toward the entryway where a gust of wind rattled the mail slot. Milo scampered after him, ears perked, but eyes uncertain. Grace chuckled under her breath. They were still fragile, still unsteady, but no longer shadows of death. They were light, barely tethered to the ground. A knock came at the door. Both puppies froze. Grace did too. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and approached the front door cautiously. When she opened it, the cold rolled in again, not bitter like before, but crisp and clean. On the stoop stood a woman bundled in a thick tan coat with a red knit scarf wrapped several times around her neck. She was about Grace's age, short and wide-hipped, with pale skin, rosy cheeks, and wild gray curls tucked beneath a beanie. She held a plastic container of banana bread and a wrinkled smile. "Thought you might be snowed in," she said. "Didn't see your car move in days." Grace blinked, recognizing the voice before the face. "Helen," she murmured. Just checking," Helen said, already stepping back. "No need for a chat. You just looked, well, I don't know what you looked, but I figured you'd want something sweet." Grace took the bread without speaking at first, then nodded. "Thank you." Helen pointed down toward the living room window, where Charlie and Milo were now peeking out. "Those yours?" "They are now," Grace said softly. Helen's eyebrows lifted, and she gave a small grunt of approval. "Well, I'd say they're lucky, but looking at your face right now, I think maybe you are too." She turned and trudged back down the snow-packed steps. Grace stood in the open doorway for a moment longer, watching her go, before closing it gently behind her. That night, Grace sat in the armchair with Milo curled against her ribs and Charlie sprawled across her feet. The fire crackled low. The journal lay open beside her, with a new page started. Calling them by name feels strange, like planting seeds in soil I thought was salted. But now I wake to the sound of paws on tile. I fall asleep to the feeling of fur brushing against my skin. I'm not alone anymore. She paused again, looked down at the small warm bodies now twitching in their sleep. Charlie gave a soft kick in his dreams. Milo's nose twitched. Grace reached out and touched both gently. She didn't say the names aloud this time. She didn't have to. The snow had settled into a crusty sheen by the time Grace Halden opened her front door for the second time that week. Not for a package or to shovel the steps, but for something far more unlikely. A walk. The sun was sharp against the late January sky, a brilliant slab of gold pushing through a smear of passing clouds. Everything outside shimmered with icy clarity. For a moment, the brightness hurt her eyes, but it was a good kind of hurt, like the first sip of strong tea after a long fast. Charlie was the first out the door. He launched himself into the snowbank beside the porch, his paws vanishing into the powder as he wiggled with glee. Milo followed slower, more cautious, his lighter coat blending nearly with the snow, He paused at the top step, sniffed the cold air, then gingerly descended behind his brother, his body sticking close to Grace's boot. Grace stepped out behind them, one gloved hand gripping a makeshift leash she'd fashioned from old curtain ties. She wore her husband's olive parka, oversized on her but surprisingly warm, and a knit cap she hadn't touched since the year after the funeral. Her breath puffed visibly in front of her, but she didn't mind. The fresh air filled her chest in a way she hadn't felt in months, maybe years. She didn't have a destination. The yard would do. She walked slowly around the edge of the small garden plot, now buried in snow, where hydrangeas once bloomed in full lavender and white. The dogs sniffed curiously at the frozen roots, tails wagging like metronomes out of sync. Grace allowed herself to smile, small at first, then full, cracked and reluctant but real. From across the street someone called out, "That you, Grace?" She turned toward the sound, shielding her eyes. George Connolly was trudging through the snow at the edge of his own yard, bundled in a deep navy coat patched at the elbows, his gloved hand gripping a snow shovel. He was tall, wiry, but tough, with a square jaw dusted in gray stubble and deep lines across his forehead that hinted at both laughter and loss. His eyes were a soft hazel, gentle, the kind of eyes that looked like they'd seen things they didn't talk about. His gait was slightly uneven, a limp, old but permanent. He stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and waved. "Didn't think I'd ever see you out here again." Grace hesitated, unsure how to respond. She hadn't spoken more than 3 words to George in years. He lived 2 doors down and had always kept to himself, like her. They shared a certain quietness, though his felt more like still waters, hers like locked doors. "The dogs needed air," she said finally, her voice hoarse with disuse. George glanced at them. "Good-looking pair. Golden retrievers?" "Rescued," she replied. "No collars. Found them during the storm." "Then they're smart too. Found the right house." His voice was warm, low, with the subtle grit of someone used to speaking in emergencies, but choosing gentleness when possible. "Names?" "Charlie and Milo," she said. He nodded with genuine approval, then reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out 2 items, a frayed leather leash and a small wool-lined dog jacket. "You'll need these," he said. "I don't use them anymore. My wife kept them in the closet just in case, but that was a long time ago." Grace didn't reach for the items right away. "Your wife?" she asked. "Passed 10 winters ago," he said plainly, no drama in his voice. "Heart failure. My daughter, she was just 9 when leukemia took her. There's not much left to walk these for anymore." Grace swallowed. The silence between them thickened, but didn't turn cold. George looked down at the pups now circling his boots. "I always thought dogs were bridges, not destinations. They bring people places, or bring them back." Grace accepted the leash and jacket without a word. Charlie barked once, then tugged gently at the new leash, clearly delighted. "You ever need a better leash, or, hell, even a ride into town?" George added, nodding toward the beat-up red pickup in his driveway. "Just holler." She offered a nod, the motion stiff but sincere. As George turned to leave, he added one final sentence over his shoulder. "Glad to see your porch lights on again." Later that evening, Grace sat with the pups curled up at her feet, the leash coiled neatly by the front door. The dog jacket now hung beside her coat on the rack, a quiet testament that she wasn't entirely alone anymore. She opened her journal and began to write. "Charlie loves the snow like it's made for him. Milo hangs close but is growing braver. I saw George Connolly today. He gave me a leash. And a story. One I didn't ask for, but needed anyway." She paused, then added, "Maybe the door wasn't just for the dogs. Maybe it was for the world." The night descended earlier than usual, not because the sun had gone down quicker, but because the clouds had thickened into a woolen ceiling that blotted out any last streaks of gold. Grace Halden stood by the kitchen window, hands gripping the porcelain edge of the sink, her breath forming small clouds on the glass. Outside, the wind hummed through bare tree limbs, sending powdered snow from the roof drifting past her line of sight like ash. Inside, the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional rustle of movement from the living room. Grace had turned off all the lights except for the kitchen lamp, a warm glow that cast her silver hair in honey tones, and made her reflection on the glass look younger than she felt. Behind her, Milo lay curled on the living room rug, his pale golden fur slightly puffed. eyes closed but alert to every sound from the couch. Charlie, however, didn't move. Earlier that day, Grace had noticed his energy falter. While Milo had been eager to chase the broom as she swept, Charlie had curled into a tight ball beneath the side table, refusing even the bit of ham she offered at lunch. He'd been quiet, too quiet. When she touched his head, it had been warm, not the good kind of warm. His breath came shallower now, and there was something about the way his paws curled that told Grace more than any vet could. She had called no one. Instead, she had boiled water, crushed aspirin into powder, as she remembered Daniel doing with Winston years ago, and carefully fed Charlie small sips of lukewarm broth using the same rubber syringe from the week before. His eyes fluttered now and then, barely open. Milo had refused to leave his side, pressing his body close as if his warmth could will his brother back into strength. Grace sat down again, gently touching Charlie's ear. "You stay with me," she murmured. "You've come too far for this." There was no response, only the steady rise and fall of shallow breathing. She stayed there until the clock struck 10, then slowly stood and went to the coat closet. Her breath caught when she reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a small velvet-lined box, one she hadn't opened in more than a decade. Inside was a wooden cross, no bigger than her palm. It was worn smooth at the edges, a faint crack down its center. She had once affixed it to the dashboard of her husband's old car, the one Adam had sat in every day on the way to school. It had survived the crash. Her family hadn't. Grace stared at it for a long time. Then, gripping it with both hands, she crossed back to the living room and knelt beside the blanket where Charlie lay. She placed the cross beside the dog's bed. Milo sniffed at it once, then curled tighter against Charlie's ribs. Grace sat back on her heels and let the silence settle around her. Then, in a voice rough from years of disuse, she began to whisper. Not a poem, not a chant, a prayer, not for herself, not even for Charlie, but for the space between life and death, where hope still flickers and souls decide if they will stay or go. "Please," she whispered, "just a little more time. Let him know he's wanted. Let him know he's loved." She did not cry. She did not fall apart. But a single tear slipped down her cheek, catching on the edge of her mouth. She didn't wipe it away. Earlier that day, just after lunch, Grace had put on her coat and walked with purpose for the first time in years. Her destination was 3 blocks away, a small church tucked between a shuttered bakery and a post office that only opened 2 days a week. The church was simple, white clapboard walls, green roof, and a crooked bell tower that leaned slightly in winter storms. Inside, it smelled of beeswax, old wood, and something faintly floral. She was greeted by a man in his late 40s with short-cropped sandy hair and a gentle demeanor. His name was Pastor Neil. Pastor Neil had a kind, open face with soft brown eyes and a faint line on his forehead that made him look perpetually thoughtful. He had moved to Balsam Ridge 5 years earlier from Des Moines and was known in town as the man who remembered everyone's name, even if he'd only met them once. He was neither pushy nor dramatic, and Grace respected that. When she told him she wanted a cross, something simple, something quiet, he had not asked why. He simply opened a small wooden drawer behind the pulpit and handed her one carved by a retired carpenter who donated them during Lent. "Would you like me to bless it?" he asked gently. Grace shook her head. "I just want it near them," she said. And that was all. He didn't press, only nodded. Sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest weight. She had nodded once, then left. Now, as the fire burned low and the kitchen window glowed with the last of its light, Grace sat back against the couch and watched over the puppies. Milo had finally fallen asleep, his nose resting beside Charlie's. And Charlie, though still silent, had shifted slightly in the blanket, his breathing deeper now. She reached over and gently placed her hand against his chest. It rose steadily beneath her palm, and for the first time all day, Grace allowed herself to exhale fully. Not a sigh of relief, but something quieter, something that felt like faith. The snow had melted in patches by the 3rd week of February, leaving behind streaks of muddy grass and slush that glittered beneath the weak morning sun. Icicles dripped rhythmically from the gutters of Grace Halden's house, tapping gently against the siding like the ticking of a clock she'd only recently remembered to wind again. The sharpest edge of winter had dulled, and in its place came the hesitant promise of something new. Spring, maybe, or something harder to name. Inside the living room, Charlie and Milo now claimed the rug beneath the window as their throne. They had doubled in size since the night Grace had found them, their coats sleek and full, their movements faster, bolder. Charlie remained the louder of the two, bounding through the hall with comical determination, while Milo had grown into a clever, quietly mischievous pup who had figured out how to nudge open the pantry door when no one was looking. Grace, for her part, had changed too. She no longer wore Daniel's old coat around the house. She had pulled out her own again, a deep burgundy wool with polished buttons and a faint coffee stain near the hem. She had her hair trimmed at the edge of her neck, and she'd begun wearing the silver locket Adam gave her on his last birthday, tucked beneath her sweater. She didn't say anything about it, but George had noticed. She had filled out the adoption paperwork 2 weeks ago. The town vet, Dr. Corwin, a tall, slim man in his 60s with large glasses and a constant look of pleasant distraction, had examined both puppies and declared them in excellent health. "You've done good by them," he had said, his voice raspy from years of cigar use. "They're lucky." "No," Grace had replied softly. "I am." Their new collars had arrived yesterday, plain brown leather with sturdy buckles. The tags, engraved in cursive script, read Charlie Halden and Milo Halden. Grace ran her fingers over the names as she fastened them around each neck. The weight of the small tags felt heavier than she expected. Not physically, but symbolically. Names were commitment. Names meant staying. She wasn't afraid of that anymore. Now, as morning sun lit the kitchen, George Connolly waited outside her front gate with a thermos of coffee and his thick wool hat pulled low over his weathered brow. He wore the same patched coat he always did, scarf tucked awkwardly around his neck. The thin limp in his left leg was more noticeable today. He'd fallen on the ice the week before, but refused to use a cane. Grace stepped outside with both dogs leashed and ready. "You're limping worse," she said as she reached the gate. "I like to keep things interesting," he replied with a crooked smile. "Makes me feel young." "You're delusional." "Probably." The park was only 4 blocks away, a small public space with a frozen pond, half-buried picnic tables, and an open patch of clearing used for sledding in better years. Today it was quiet. The air had that crisp stillness that follows thaw, a cold that bites only at the skin, not the soul. They walked slowly, letting the dogs lead the pace. Charlie tugged ahead, sniffing every tree trunk and snowbank like a patrol officer, while Milo stuck close, occasionally darting forward when he saw a squirrel, then pretending he hadn't been startled at all. George broke the silence first. "I don't think I've seen you smile that much since the day I moved in." "You weren't paying attention," Grace said. "Oh, I was. You just weren't offering." They reached the edge of the park where the snow was shallower, the grass poking through in pale brown blades. Grace unhooked the leashes and let the dogs go. Charlie bounded forward with a triumphant bark, and Milo zipped after him, their paws churning up the thawing earth. For a long time they just stood there, watching. George pulled the thermos from his coat and poured 2 small cups. The steam curled upward in the light like wisps of memory. "You ever think you'd come back to this?" he asked. Grace took the cup and stared at the pups now wrestling in a patch of snow. "Not once," she said, "but I'm glad I was wrong." George nodded. "My wife used to say that surviving is just the first part, the real living happens after." "Smart woman." "She was," he said, "and stubborn, like someone else I know." Grace smiled again, but it was gentler this time. They sat down on a bench, the wood cold beneath them, but tolerable with the warmth in their hands. For a while they said nothing. The breeze carried the scent of pine and old leaves, of winter releasing its grip. Finally, Grace spoke. "I think," she began, her voice quiet, "I think I still have time to start again." George didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "This is the number for the community center downtown. They're looking for volunteers for the spring book drive." Grace took it, surprised. "What makes you think I'd want to?" "You're still reading," he said, pointing to the worn mystery novel peeking from her coat pocket, "and you're not hiding anymore." The dogs came bounding back, snow on their snouts and tongues lolling in wild delight. Charlie jumped up with his front paws on Grace's knees, tail wagging like mad. Milo followed, resting his head on George's boot. Grace scratched behind Charlie's ears. "Home," she said softly. George looked at her. Yours or mine? She smiled. Both. Sometimes God doesn't speak in thunder. Sometimes he whispers in paw prints at your door. Charlie and Milo weren't just lost puppies. They were a message, a reminder, that even in the coldest winters of our soul, even when we've closed every door, he still finds a way in. Whether it's through a child's laughter, a stranger's kindness, or two tiny paws scratching faintly on a frozen doorstep. Miracles do not shout. They arrive quietly. Grace thought her story was finished, but God wasn't done writing. And maybe, just maybe, he's not done with yours either. So if you've ever felt like giving up, if the world has gone quiet and cold around you, look again. Listen closer. Your miracle might already be at the door. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs hope. And hit that subscribe button to stay close to stories that restore your faith in love, in kindness, and in the quiet ways God works. May God bless you, and may you always have the courage to open the door.